North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. Edith, said Margaret gently. Edith. But as Margaret half suspected, Edith had fallen asleep. She lay curled up on the sofa in the back drawing-room in Harley Street, looking very lovely in her white muslin and blue ribbons. Margaret was struck afresh by her cousin's beauty. They had grown up together from childhood, and all along Edith had been remarked upon by everyone for her prettiness. They had been talking about wedding dresses and wedding ceremonies, and Captain Lennox, and what he had told Edith about their future life at Corfu, where his regiment was stationed, and the difficulty of keeping a piano in good tune, a difficulty which Edith seemed to consider as one of the most formidable that could befall her in her married life, and what gowns she would want in the visit to Scotland, which would immediately succeed her marriage. But the whispered tone had latterly become more drowsy, and Margaret, after a pause of a few minutes, found, as she fancied, that in spite of the buzz in the next room, Edith had rolled herself up into a soft ball of muslin and ribbon and silken curls and gone off into a peaceful little after-dinner nap. Margaret had been on the point of telling her cousin of some of the plans and visions which she entertained to her future life in the country parsonage, where her father and mother lived, and where her bright holidays had always been passed, though for the last 10 years her Aunt Shaw's house had been considered as her home. But in default of a listener, she had to brood over the change in her life silently. It was a happy brooding, although tinged with regret at being separated for an indefinite time from her gentle aunt and dear cousin. As she thought of the delight of filling the important post of only daughter in Helstone Parsonage, pieces of the conversation out of the next room came upon her ears. Her Aunt Shaw was talking to the 5 or 6 ladies who had been dining there and whose husbands were still in the dining room. These ladies and their husbands were invited to eat a farewell dinner in honour of Edith's approaching marriage. Mrs. Shaw had rather urged on the marriage, although it was below the expectations which many of Edith's acquaintances had formed for her, a young and pretty heiress. But Mrs. Shaw said that her only child should marry for love, and sighed emphatically, as if love had not been her motive for marrying the late General. Mrs. Shaw enjoyed the romance of the present engagement rather more than her daughter. Not but that Edith was very thoroughly and properly in love. Still, she would certainly have preferred a good house in Belgravia to all the picturesqueness of the life which Captain Lennox described at Corfu. The very parts which made Margaret glow as she listened, Edith pretended to shiver and shudder at, partly for the pleasure she had in being coaxed out of her dislike by her fond lover, and partly because anything of a gypsy or makeshift life was really distasteful to her. Margaret overheard her aunt saying, "I have spared no expense in her trousseau. She has all the beautiful Indian shawls and scarves the General gave to me, but which I will never wear again. Edith! Edith!" Margaret stepped forward. "Edith is asleep, Aunt Shaw. Is it anything I can do?" "It was only to ask Edith if she would tell Newton to bring down her shawls. Perhaps you would go, Margaret, dear." Margaret went up into the old nursery at the very top of the house, where Newton was busy getting up some laces which were required for the wedding. While Newton went, not without a muttered grumbling, to undo the shawls which had already been exhibited 4 or 5 times that day, Margaret looked around upon the nursery, the first room in that house with which she had become familiar 9 years ago, when she was brought, all untamed from the New Forest, to share the home, the play, and the lessons of her cousin Edith. She remembered the dark, dim look of the London nursery, presided over by an austere and ceremonious nurse, who was terribly particular about clean hands and torn frocks. At home, before she came to live in Harley Street, her mother's dressing-room had been her nursery, and as they kept early hours in the country parsonage, Margaret had always had her meals with her father and mother. Oh, well did the tall, stately girl of 18 remember the tears shed with such wild passion of grief by the little girl of 9, as she hid her face under the bedclothes in that first night, and how she was bidden not to cry by the nurse, because it would disturb Miss Edith. Now she had got to love the old nursery, though it was but a dismantled place, and she looked all round with a kind of cat-like regret at the idea of leaving it for ever in 3 days. Margaret went down laden with shawls and snuffing up their spicy eastern smell. Her aunt asked her to stand as a sort of lay figure on which to display them, as Edith was still asleep. Her tall, finely made figure set off the long, beautiful folds of the gorgeous shawls that would have half smothered Edith. Just then the door opened, and Mr. Henry Lennox was suddenly announced. Mrs. Shaw held out her hand to the newcomer. Margaret stood perfectly still, but looking at Mr. Lennox with a bright, amused face, as if sure of his sympathy and her sense of the ludicrousness at being thus surprised. Her aunt was so much absorbed in asking Mr. Henry Lennox, who had not been able to come to dinner, all sorts of questions about his brother, the bridegroom, his sister, the bridesmaid, coming with the captain from Scotland for the occasion, and various other members of the Lennox family, that Margaret saw she was no more wanted as shawl-bearer, and devoted herself to the amusement of the other visitors, whom her aunt had for the moment forgotten. Almost immediately Edith came in from the back drawing-room, winking and blinking her eyes at the stronger light, shaking back her slightly ruffled curls. As Margaret sank rather more into the background on her cousin's joining the conversation, she saw Henry Lennox directing his look towards a vacant seat near her, and she knew perfectly well that as soon as Edith released him from her questioning, he would take possession of that chair. She had not been quite sure, from her aunt's rather confused account of his engagements, whether he would come that night. It was almost a surprise to see him, and now she was sure of a pleasant evening. He liked and disliked pretty nearly the same things that she did. Margaret's face was lightened up into an honest, open brightness. By and by he came. She received him with a smile which had not a tinge of shyness or self-consciousness in it. "Well, I suppose you are all in the depths of business. Ladies' business, I mean. Very different to my business, which is the real, true law business. Playing with shawls is very different work to drawing up settlements. Ah, I knew you would be amused to find us all so occupied in admiring finery. But really, Indian shawls are very perfect things of their kind." "I have no doubt they are. Their prices are very perfect too, nothing wanting." The gentlemen came dropping in one by one, and the buzz and noise deepened in tone. "This is your last dinner party, is it not? There are no more before Thursday?" "No. I think after this evening we shall feel at rest, which I am sure I have not done for many weeks. At least, that kind of rest when the hands have nothing more to do and all the arrangements are complete for an event which must occupy one's head and heart. I shall be glad to have time to think, and I am sure Edith will." "I'm not so sure about her, but I can fancy that you will. Whenever I have seen you lately, you have been carried away by a whirlwind of some other person's making." "Yes," said Margaret, rather sadly, remembering the never-ending commotion about trifles that had been going on for more than a month past. "I wonder if a marriage must always be preceded by what you call a whirlwind, or whether in some cases there might not be a calm and peaceful time just before it." "But how would you have a wedding arranged?" asked Mr. Lennox. "Oh, I've never thought much about it. Only I should like it to be a very fine summer morning, and I should like to walk to church through the shade of trees, and not to have so many bridesmaids and to have no wedding breakfast. I dare say I am resolving against the very things that have given me the most trouble just now." "No, I don't think you are. The idea of stately simplicity accords well with your character." Margaret did not quite like this speech. She winced away from it, remembering former occasions on which he had tried to lead her into a discussion about her own character and ways of going on. She cut his speech rather short by saying, "It is natural for me to think of Helstone Church and the walk to it, rather than of driving up to a London church in the middle of a paved street. Tell me about Helstone. You have never described it to me. I should like to have some idea of the place you will be living in after you leave 96 Harley Street. Is Helstone a village or a town in the first place?" "Oh, only a hamlet. I don't think I could call it a village at all. There is the church and a few houses near it on the green, cottages, rather, with roses growing all over them. And flowering all the year round, especially at Christmas, make your picture complete," said he. "No," replied Margaret, somewhat annoyed. "I am not making a picture. I am trying to describe Helstone as it really is. You should not have said that." "I am penitent," he answered. "Only it really sounded like a village in a tale rather than in real life." "And so it is," replied Margaret eagerly. "All the other places in England that I have seen seem so hard and prosaic-looking after the New Forest. Helstone is like a village in a poem, in one of Tennyson's poems. But I won't try to describe it any more. You would only laugh at me if I told you what I think, what it really is. Indeed, I would not, said Henry Lennox. Margaret was once more travelling quietly home with her father, who had come out to assist at the wedding. Her mother had been detained at home by a multitude of half-reasons, none of which anybody fully understood except Mr. Hale, who was perfectly aware that all his arguments in favour of a grey satin gown, which was midway between oldness and newness, had proved unavailing, and that, as he had not the money to equip his wife afresh from top to toe, she would not show herself at her only sister's only child's wedding. Dearest Maria had married the man of her heart, only 8 years older than herself, with the sweetest temper, and that blue-black hair one so seldom sees. Mr. Hale was one of the most delightful preachers she had ever heard, and a perfect model of a parish priest. Perhaps it was not quite a logical deduction from all these premises, but it was still Mrs. Shaw's characteristic conclusion, as she thought over her sister's lot. Married for love. What can dearest Maria have to wish for in this world? Mrs. Hale, if she spoke truth, might have answered with a ready-made list. A silver grey lace silk, a white chip bonnet, oh, dozens of things for the wedding and hundreds of things for the house. Margaret only knew that her mother had not found it convenient to come, and she was not sorry to think that their meeting and greeting would take place at Helstone Parsonage rather than during the confusion of the last 2 or 3 days, in the house in Harley Street, where she herself had to play the part of Figaro and was wanted everywhere at one and the same time. Her mind and body ached now with the recollection of all she had done and had said within the last 48 hours. The farewells, so hurriedly taken amongst all the other goodbyes, of those she had lived with so long, oppressed her now with a sad regret for the times that were no more. It did not signify what those times had been. They were gone never to return. Margaret's heart felt more heavy than she could ever have thought it possible in going to her own dear home, the place and the life she had longed for years. At that time of all times, her yearning and longing, just before the sharp senses lose their outlines in sleep. She took her mind away with a wrench from the recollection of the past to the bright, serene contemplation of the hopeful future. Her eyes began to see, not visions of what had been, but the sight actually before her. Her dear father leaning back asleep in the railway carriage. His blue-black hair was grey now and lay thinly over his brows. The bones of his face were plainly to be seen. Too plainly for beauty. If his features had been less finely cut, as it was, they had a grace, if not a comeliness, of their own. The face was in repose, but it was rather rest after weariness than the serene calm of the countenance of one who led a placid, contented life. Oh, if Frederick had been but a clergyman, instead of going into the navy and being lost to us all. I wish I knew about it. I never understood it from Aunt Shaw. I only knew he could not come back to England because of that terrible affair. Poor dear papa, how sad he looks. I'm so glad I'm going home, to be at hand to comfort him and mamma. She was ready with a bright smile, in which there were not a trace of fatigue, to greet her father when he awakened. He smiled back again, but faintly, as if it were an unusual exertion. His face returned into its lines of habitual anxiety. He had a trick of half opening his mouth as if to speak, which constantly unsettled the form of his lips and gave the face an undecided expression. But he had the same large, soft eyes as his daughter, eyes which moved slowly and almost grandly round in their orbits, and were well veiled by their transparent white eyelids. Margaret was more like him than like her mother. Sometimes people wondered that parents so handsome should have a daughter who was so far from regularly beautiful. Not beautiful at all, was occasionally said. Her mouth was wide, no rosebud that could hardly just open enough to let out a yes and a no, "An't please you, sir," but the wide mouth was one soft curve of rich red lips, and the skin, if not white and fair, was of an ivory smoothness and delicacy.